In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where slave ships drift between forgotten worlds, most sentient beings learn a cruel truth. Survival means silence, compliance means life, and hope is a luxury that gets you killed. But humans never learn to follow the rules. When maintenance technician Jake Morrison stumbles upon a caged predator in the bowels of a pirate vessel, he faces a choice that will reshape the balance of an ancient war. The creature behind the energy bars isn't just any alien. It's a member of the HFY, legendary warriors who once terrorized entire star systems before vanishing into myth. What Jake doesn't know is that this isn't a random encounter. The HFY have been searching for something specific among the younger races for over 3 centuries, a species with the particular brand of reckless courage needed to stand against an enemy that has consumed galaxies. And they just found exactly what they were looking for. The question isn't whether Jake will free the alien warrior. The question is whether the galaxy is ready for what happens when an unstoppable human meets an ancient guardian who has been waiting for this moment since before Earth learned to build fires. Some partnerships are forged in battle, others are forged in defiance. This one will be forged in both. The emergency klaxon screamed through the corridors of the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream, its red warning lights painting everything in bloody shadows. Jake Morrison wiped grease from his hands with a stained cloth, cursing under his breath as another alarm joined the cacophony. 3 weeks into what should have been a routine cargo run to the Centauri colonies, and everything that could go wrong had gone spectacularly wrong. "Morrison!" Captain Chen's voice crackled through the comm system. "Where's my engine report?" Jake pressed the talk button with his elbow, keeping his hands free to work on the plasma coupling that had decided to leak radiation into the engine bay. "Still working on it, Cap. This bucket of bolts needs a complete overhaul, not field repairs with spare parts older than my grandmother. Just get us to the next station, Morrison. We're already behind schedule." The communication cut off, leaving Jake alone with the ship's mechanical heartbeat and the increasingly concerning vibrations coming from the main drive. He'd been the ship's only mechanic for 2 years now, ever since the company decided that hiring one competent human was cheaper than maintaining a full engineering crew. It was a decision they'd regretted exactly 17 times in the past 6 months. But Jake's contract was ironclad. The plasma coupling finally sealed properly, and Jake allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before moving to the next crisis. The environmental recyclers were making grinding noises that suggested imminent failure, and the artificial gravity generator had developed a disturbing tendency to fluctuate randomly. He'd already walked on the ceiling twice today, and his coffee had achieved orbit during lunch. As he crawled through the maintenance tunnel toward the recycling units, Jake's headlamp illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. The tunnel branched off to the left, disappearing into shadows that his ship's schematics insisted were just empty space. In 2 years of maintaining this ship, he'd memorized every bolt, every panel, every redundant system that the manufacturers had crammed into the hull. This passage didn't exist on any blueprint he'd ever seen. Jake's curiosity had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. From the incident with the experimental drive core on Kepler Station to the unfortunate business with the alien artifact that had tried to rewrite his DNA. But it had also made him the kind of mechanic who could keep ancient ships running with nothing but ingenuity and stubbornness. He squeezed through the opening, following the passage as it curved downward into the ship's belly. The air here was different, staler, colder, carrying strange scents that made his skin crawl. His headlamp beam revealed walls that were clearly not part of the original ship construction. The metal was darker, etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the whole area hummed with barely contained energy. The passage opened into a chamber that definitely wasn't on any schematic. Jake stood in the doorway, trying to process what he was seeing. The room was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with walls covered in the same dark metal and alien script. But it was what sat in the center that made his breath catch in his throat. A cage. Not just any cage. This was a containment unit of obviously alien design, crackling with energy barriers that cast blue-white light across the chamber. and inside the cage was something that made every primitive instinct in Jake's brain scream at him to run. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, even hunched over as it was. Its body was covered in midnight black fur marked with silver stripes that seemed to shift and flow in the energy field's light. Dad doesn't make the truss steady. 4 arms, each ending in hands that could easily span Jake's entire head, tipped with claws that looked like they could tear through ship's hull. The face was distinctly feline, but scaled up to nightmare proportions, with fangs that gleamed like polished bone and eyes that burned with an inner fire that definitely wasn't natural. Jake had seen aliens before. The galaxy was full of them, and most were peaceful traders or colonists trying to make a living like everyone else. But this thing was different. This was a predator, something designed by evolution or engineering to hunt and kill with perfect efficiency, and it was staring directly at him. "Well," Jake said quietly, surprised that his voice was steady, "this is new." The creature's ears flicked forward at the sound, and its burning eyes tracked his movement as he stepped fully into the chamber. Jake noticed several things simultaneously. First, that the alien was wearing the remnants of what might have been armor or clothing, though most of it had been torn away or deliberately removed. Second, that there were fresh wounds visible through the fur, some still bleeding despite what looked like recent medical attention. Third, and most importantly, that despite its fearsome appearance, the creature's posture spoke of exhaustion and defeat rather than immediate threat. "You're a prisoner," Jake said, more to himself than to the alien. "But what the hell is Captain Chen doing with a cage in his ship?" The creature's head tilted slightly, and Jake could have sworn he saw recognition flicker in those burning eyes. It made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something that carried meaning, even if Jake couldn't understand the words. Jake approached the cage slowly, hands visible and empty. He'd learned early in his career that most problems could be solved with the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right approach. This looked like a problem that needed solving, even if he didn't fully understand what it was yet. The containment field hummed with barely restrained power, but Jake's trained eye could see the system's weaknesses. The energy projectors were standard Vorthan design, expensive, reliable, but with a known vulnerability in the harmonic frequency modulation. He'd worked on similar systems during his military service, back before he'd decided that fixing things was more satisfying than breaking them. "You know," Jake said conversationally as he circled the cage, examining the control systems, "I've got a strict policy about slavery. Teddy. Specifically, I'm against it." The alien watched his every move with the kind of focused attention that suggested high intelligence despite its bestial appearance. When Jake knelt beside the main control panel, the creature moved for the first time, shifting to track his position while making that same almost speech sound. "Yeah, I know," Jake replied as if he'd understood perfectly. "Prison breaks aren't exactly in my job description. But then again, neither is finding secret alien prisoners in the ship I'm supposed to be maintaining." The control panel was more sophisticated than Jake had expected, with multiple layers of security and what looked like remote monitoring systems. Whoever had installed this setup had wanted to keep very close track of their prisoner, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd used standard components that Jake recognized. "The thing is," Jake continued, pulling tools from his belt, "I've got a real problem with authority figures who think they can hide things from their maintenance crew. Captain Chen's been acting weird for weeks, and now I know why." The alien made another sound, softer this time, and Jake glanced up to see something that might have been hope in those burning eyes. "Don't get your hopes up yet, big guy. I might be about to make things worse for both of us." Jake had always been good with his hands, whether he was rebuilding engines or defusing bombs. The control system fought him. Layers of encryption and fail-safes designed to prevent exactly what he was trying to do. But Jake had been breaking things and putting them back together since he was old enough to hold a screwdriver, and he'd never met a machine he couldn't outsmart given enough time and motivation. The first security layer fell away after 10 minutes of careful work. The second took 20. The third required Jake to bypass the main power coupling and reroute commands through the backup systems, a trick he'd learned during a particularly memorable incident involving a malfunctioning airlock and a very angry Port Authority inspector. As he worked, Jake became aware that the alien was watching him with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. There was something almost reverent in its attention, as if it was witnessing something significant rather than just a routine jailbreak. "You know," Jake said as he finalized the bypass sequence, "I probably should have asked if you're going to eat me once I let you out. It's the kind of question that seems important in hindsight." The alien made a sound that Jake could have sworn was laughter, low and rumbling but unmistakably amused. It pressed one massive hand against the energy barrier, and Jake noticed that its claws weren't extended, a gesture that spoke of intelligence and perhaps even gratitude. "Well, that's something at least." Jake initiated the shutdown sequence, and the energy barrier flickered once before dissolving completely. The alien stood slowly, unfolding to its full impressive height, and Jake felt a moment of pure terror as he realized exactly how outmatched he would be if this went badly. Instead, the creature sank to one knee, bringing its massive head down to Jake's eye level. It placed one hand over its heart and spoke, the words clearly in its own language, but somehow carrying unmistakable meaning. "You're welcome," Jake said, though he suspected the gesture meant far more than a simple thank you. The alien stood again and moved to a section of the wall that Jake had thought was just decoration. Its claws traced patterns in the alien script, and a hidden panel slid open to reveal what looked like personal effects, weapons, armor, and items that Jake couldn't identify but that clearly held importance. As the creature began to arm itself with practiced efficiency, Jake heard footsteps in the passage behind him. "Morrison!" Captain Chen's voice echoed off the tunnel walls. "What the hell are you doing down there?" Jake turned to see Chen emerging into the chamber, followed by 3 crew members Jake didn't recognize. Definitely not part of the ship's regular complement. All 4 were armed, and none of them looked particularly friendly. "Well," Jake said, stepping slightly to place himself between the alien and the newcomers, "I guess we're about to find out what this is really about." Chen's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady as he raised his weapon. "Step away from the Kethvar, Morrison. You have no idea what you've done." "Kethvar?" Jake glanced back at his new alien friend, who had finished arming itself and now stood like a statue, carved from midnight and starlight. "Never heard of them." "That's because they're supposed to be extinct," one of Chen's companions said. "Wiped out 300 years ago in the Vorthan Wars. This one is worth more than 100 ships like this one." Jake felt something click into place in his mind. "You're slavers. We're entrepreneurs," Chen corrected, "and you just cost us a fortune." The alien, the Kethvar, spoke for the first time in what might have been standard, its voice deep and resonant despite the obvious effort required to form unfamiliar sounds. "Human, you have shown honor. Step aside." "Yeah, that's not happening," Jake said, surprised by his own certainty. "I've got a policy about people who cage thinking beings, and it's not a friendly one." Chen's eyes narrowed. "Kill the mechanic. We can make up some story about an accident." Jake had been in combat before during his military service, but never quite like this. As Chen's finger tightened on his weapon's trigger, Jake threw himself sideways, rolled behind the alien cage's base structure, and came up with his plasma cutter in hand. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. What happened next changed everything Jake thought he knew about the universe. The Kethvar moved like liquid shadow, crossing the 20 feet between itself and Chen's group in the time it took Jake to blink. The first slaver went down without even managing to scream, claws that moved faster than thought opening his throat with surgical precision. The second managed to fire once, the energy blast scorching fur but barely slowing the alien warrior down before 4-inch claws punched through his chest armor like it was made of paper. Chen and the remaining slaver tried to retreat, but the chamber had only one exit, and the Kethvar stood between them and escape. Jake watched in fascination and horror as the alien warrior methodically dismantled 2 armed opponents with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of centuries of experience. When the violence ended, Jake found himself alone in a chamber with 4 corpses and an 8-foot-tall alien predator whose fur was barely mussed despite having just killed 3 armed men in less than 10 seconds. Eddie, the Kethvar, turned to face him, and Jake realized that this was the moment that would define everything that came after. He could try to run, try to fight, try to negotiate, or try to hide. Instead, he did what he always did when faced with a complex problem. He tried to understand it. "So," Jake said, setting his plasma cutter aside in a deliberate show of trust, "I'm guessing this makes us partners in a mutual crime situation." The alien studied him for a long moment, those burning eyes seeming to look right through him. Then it did something Jake hadn't expected. It smiled, revealing fangs that could have easily removed his head, but somehow managing to convey amusement rather than threat. "Partners," the Kethvar repeated, the word sounding strange in its deep voice but carrying unmistakable approval. Jake looked around the chamber, taking in the bodies, the alien script on the walls, and the obviously advanced technology that had been hidden in his ship for who knows how long. "Well," he said finally, "this is definitely going to require some creative problem-solving." The Kethvar made that rumbling sound that might have been laughter again, and Jake realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated and probably much shorter. But somehow he was looking forward to finding out what came next. The alien warrior stood motionless in the center of the chamber, its breathing so controlled that Jake might have thought it was a statue if not for those burning eyes that tracked every movement. Jake had seen enough violence in his military days to know the difference between someone who fought when cornered and someone who was built for war from the cellular level up. This Kethvar was definitely the latter. "So," Jake said, settling his nerves with practiced calm, "I don't suppose you have a name that doesn't sound like clearing your throat." The alien tilted its massive head, and when it spoke, the words came more easily this time, as if it was remembering how to use this. "I am called Vexhalia in your approximation. War Singer of the Fourth Claw, Guardian of the Deep Void, Last Sword of the Burning Fleet." "Those are some impressive titles," Jake replied. "I'm Jake Morrison, maintenance technician, coffee enthusiast, and apparently accidental prison liberator." Vexhalia's ears flicked in what Jake was beginning to recognize as amusement. "Your naming customs are efficient?" Jake looked around the chamber again, really taking in the details now that the immediate threat was past. The alien script on the walls seemed to pulse with its own light, and the more he studied it, the more he was convinced that it wasn't just decoration. "How long have you been down here?" 17 of your rotations around this system's star," Vexhalia replied without hesitation. "Captured during the raid on Nexus Station, sold to these entrepreneurs, as they called themselves. 17 months. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. "And Chen's been running slaving operations this whole time while I've been keeping his ship running." "The captain was merely a transport mechanism," Vexhalia said, beginning to examine the chamber walls with professional interest. "The true operators of this network are far more dangerous than these dead fools." Jake followed the alien's gaze to the script-covered walls. "What is all this?" "This whole chamber is off the ship's blueprints, Vorthan containment technology, modified with Kethvar binding rituals." Vexhalia's claws traced patterns in the air above the glowing symbols, designed specifically to hold my kind. "The Vorthans learned much from studying our prisoners during the war. The war you supposedly lost," Jake said. Vexhalia went very still, and Jake realized he might have touched on something sensitive. When the alien spoke again, its voice carried harmonics that made Jake's bones ache. "We did not lose human Jake Morrison. We chose." "Chose what?" "To wait." Before Jake could ask for clarification, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Not the standard emergency klaxons he was used to, but something new, a high-pitched whine that spoke of incoming threats and immediate danger. "Well, that can't be good," Jake muttered, pulling out his comm unit. The device crackled with interference, but he could make out fragments of panicked voices from the bridge crew. Day. Unknown ships appeared out of nowhere demanding surrender. Energy signatures don't match anything in the database. They're jamming all communications. Jake looked at Vexhalia, who had gone into what Jake was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of combat alertness. "Enemies of yours," Vexhalia replied grimly. "The Vorthans have found their missing property." The ship shuddered as something large docked with the hull, followed by the distinctive sound of cutting tools working on metal. Jake had been in enough boarding actions to recognize the signs. They had maybe minutes before hostile forces made their way through the ship. "How many?" Jake asked, checking his plasma cutter's charge level. A standard retrieval team would be 12 warriors, plus technical support. Vexhalia was moving around the chamber gathering items from hidden alcoves that Jake hadn't noticed before. "They will kill everyone aboard except for me, whom they will recapture." "That seems like poor customer service," Jake said, trying to keep his tone light despite the fear coursing through his veins. "What are options?" Vexhalia paused in its preparations and fixed Jake with a stare that seemed to look into his soul. "Our options? We're partners, remember? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. We both try not to die horribly." The alien made that rumbling sound again, but this time Jake caught undertones that suggested surprise rather than amusement. "You would fight beside me against the Vorthans? Your species has no stake in this conflict." "My species has a real problem with people who think they can board our ships and kill our crews," Jake replied, surprised by the strength of his own conviction. "Plus, slavery pisses me off on general principle." Vexhalia studied him for a long moment, then did something Jake didn't expect. The alien knelt again, but this time it removed something from around its neck, a pendant of some kind, made from metal that seemed to hold starlight within its surface. "Hold out your hand, Jake Morrison." Jake extended his palm and Vexhalia placed the pendant against his skin. The metal was warm, almost alive, and the moment it touched him, Jake felt something change. Not physically, though there was definitely a tingling sensation, but something deeper, as if the universe had just shifted its perspective on his existence. "What did you just do?" Jake asked, looking at the pendant. The metal seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "I have marked you as Kethvar friend," Vexhalia said, standing again. "Among my people. This is an honor that has not been granted to an alien in over 3,000 years. And what does that mean, practically speaking? It means that any Kethvar who sees that mark will consider your enemies to be their enemies, your battles to be their battles, and your death to be cause for blood debt that extends to the 7th generation." Jake stared at the pendant, feeling its weight in ways that had nothing to do with gravity. "That seems like a lot of responsibility." "It is, but it also means you are no longer just Jake Morrison, maintenance technician. You are Jake Morrison, friend of the Kethvar, and that makes you one of the most protected beings in this galaxy." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time, and Jake heard the distinct sound of hull plating being peeled away like the skin of an orange. Whatever was cutting through the ship's defenses was making rapid progress. "How do we fight 12 alien warriors with military training?" Jake asked. "We do not fight them," Vexhalia said, gathering the last of its equipment. "We hunt them." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the alien's tone that spoke of experience with this exact situation. "You've done this before. Many times. The Vorthans have attempted to recapture me 7 times since my imprisonment. None of those teams returned to their ships." "But you were locked in a cage," Jake pointed out. Vexhalia's smile this time was all teeth and violence. "The cage was never meant to hold me forever, Jake Morrison. It was meant to make me desperate enough to consider alternatives to death." "What kind of alternatives?" "The Vorthans have been trying to break my people for 3 centuries. They believe that if they can force one of us to serve them willingly, they can use that leverage to bring the rest of our kind under their control." Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. "You're not just any prisoner. You're someone important. I am the last living member of the Kethvar High Command. When I die, the war ends and my people accept exile to the void between galaxies." The weight of that statement hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd thought he was just helping one alien prisoner, but apparently he'd just stepped into the middle of an interstellar conflict that had been raging since before humans had invented the wheel. "So, no pressure," Jake said weakly. "Indeed." Vexhalia moved to what Jake had thought was a blank section of wall and pressed its palm against the metal. Hidden panels slid open, revealing an arsenal that belonged in a museum of warfare. Weapons that looked like they'd been forged from crystallized light and shadows, armor that seemed to drink in the chamber's illumination, and devices that Jake couldn't even begin to identify. "The Vorthans made one critical error when they captured me," Vexhalia said, beginning to don its armor with practiced efficiency. "They assumed that because I allowed myself to be taken, I had given up." "Had you?" Jake asked. "No, I was waiting." "For what?" Vexhalia paused in its preparations and looked directly at Jake. "For someone like you." Before Jake could ask what that meant, the ship's lights went out, replaced by the red glow of emergency power. In the distance, he could hear the sound of fighting, energy weapons discharging, hull plating being torn apart, and the occasional human scream that made his blood run cold. "They have taken the bridge," Vexhalia said, its voice carrying an authority that made Jake stand straighter despite himself. "The remaining crew will be dead within moments." "We have to help them," Jake said, starting toward the chamber entrance. "We cannot. They are already lost." Vexhalia caught Jake's arm with one massive hand, the grip gentle but immovable. "But we can ensure their deaths have meaning." Jake wanted to argue, wanted to demand they try to save whoever might still be alive, but the rational part of his mind knew the alien was right. He'd seen enough combat to recognize the sounds of a one-sided slaughter, and throwing themselves into that would only add to the body count. "What's the plan?" he asked. "The Vorthans will search the ship systematically, looking for me. They know I was held in this chamber, so they will eventually find us. But they will expect to find me weakened, unarmed, and alone. Instead, they'll find you ready for a fight and backed up by someone they don't expect." More than that, Vexhalia finished donning its armor and picked up a weapon that looked like it had been carved from a piece of the night sky itself. "They will find me free, armed, and accompanied by someone who carries the mark of Kethvar friendship." And why is that significant? Because it means I am no longer the last of my kind. Jake Morrison. The mark you wear makes you family, and family is worth fighting for. Jake looked at the pendant again, feeling its weight and warmth against his chest. He was beginning to understand that he'd stepped into something far larger than a simple prisoner rescue. This wasn't just about freeing one alien from captivity. It was about changing the balance of an ancient war. "So what do we do?" Jake asked. Vexhalia's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "We remind the Vorthans why my people are called the Scourge of Stars." The first explosion shook the ship so violently that Jake was thrown against the chamber wall. Through the sound of twisting metal and escaping atmosphere, he could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons being fired at full power. "They are coming!" Vexhalia said, moving to a position beside the chamber entrance. "Remember, Jake Morrison, when this begins, trust your instincts and stay behind me." The Vorthans are warriors, but they have forgotten what it means to face true predators. Jake checked his plasma cutter one more time and tried to convince himself that he wasn't about to die in a horrible and probably brief manner. "Any advice for someone who's never fought alien space warriors before? Do not hesitate. Do not show mercy. And do not forget that you are no longer fighting alone." The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel leading to their chamber, multiple sets moving with military precision. Jake felt his heart rate spike as he realized that everything that had happened so far was just the prelude. The real fight was about to begin. "Vexhalia," Jake said quietly, "if we don't make it through this, we will," the alien replied with absolute certainty. Because the alternative is unacceptable. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the hum of energy weapons and what sounded like scanning equipment. Jake gripped his plasma cutter and tried to remember everything he'd learned about combat during his military service. None of it seemed particularly relevant when facing alien warriors with technology that probably outclassed anything humanity had ever built. "Jake Morrison," Vexhalia said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. "Today you learn why the Kethvar have never known defeat. Today you see what it means to fight as family." The first shadow appeared at the chamber entrance, and Jake felt time slow to a crawl as everything he'd thought he knew about the universe prepared to change forever. The war for the stars was about to begin, and somehow, impossibly, he was right in the middle of it. The first Vorthan warrior to enter the chamber died before Jake even saw it move. One moment the tunnel entrance was empty except for shadows. The next there was a spray of green blood across the far wall, and Vexhalia was already repositioning for the next target. Jake had fought in 3 different military conflicts during his service years, but he'd never seen anything like what happened in the next 30 seconds. The Vorthans were clearly experienced soldiers. They moved with precision, used advanced tactics, and their technology was obviously superior to anything Jake had encountered. But Vexhalia fought like physics was just a suggestion, and death was a personal friend. The alien warrior flowed through the chamber like liquid violence, its 4 arms moving independently to wield weapons, deflect incoming fire, and tear apart anyone foolish enough to come within reach of those claws. Energy blasts that should have been fatal seared through empty air where Vexhalia had been a microsecond before, while return fire from the aliens' weapons, which seemed to shoot controlled bursts of darkness itself, found targets with surgical precision. "Trust Teddy." Jake tried to help, raising his plasma cutter to fire at a Vorthan who was flanking around the chamber's edge, but the enemy was already falling with 4 parallel gashes across its throat before Jake could pull the trigger. "Move!" Vexhalia's voice cut through the chaos. "The tunnel!" Jake didn't question the order. He dove toward the tunnel entrance, rolling behind what remained of the first Vorthan's body as energy blasts scorched the air where he'd been standing. The alien warrior followed, moving backward while maintaining covering fire, its movement so fluid that it seemed to be dancing rather than fighting for its life. They emerged into the maintenance tunnel to find it full of smoke, flickering lights, and the sound of approaching reinforcements. Jake's knowledge of the ship's layout suddenly became their most valuable asset. "This way," he said, leading them through a junction that would take them toward the engineering sections. "We can use the service corridors to avoid the main passages." "How many more warriors will they send?" Jake asked as they moved through the twisting maintenance ways. "Standard doctrine calls for a 12-warrior retrieval team," Vexhalia replied. Its breathing barely elevated despite having just fought off 5 heavily armed soldiers. "But they will have support ships standing by if the first team fails." Meaning? We have perhaps 1 hour before they decide to destroy the ship and everything on it rather than risk losing more personnel. Jake felt his stomach drop. "Can't we just surrender?" "Explain that you were being held prisoner. The Vorthans do not recognize the concept of innocent bystanders," Vexhalia said grimly. "Anyone who has seen me free is a security risk that must be eliminated." They reached the engineering deck to find it empty but heavily damaged. The Vorthans had clearly been thorough in their search, tearing apart equipment and leaving scorch marks on every surface. Jake's carefully maintained systems were ruins, which hurt almost as much as seeing the bodies of crew members scattered throughout the compartments. "They killed everyone," Jake said, kneeling beside the body of Sarah Okafor, the ship's communications officer. He'd shared coffee with her just that morning, listening to her complain about her boyfriend's inability to remember to call home while on long runs. "This is what the Vorthans do," Vexhalia said, its voice carrying centuries of cold fury. "They do not conquer. They consume. Every world they take, every species they subjugate becomes nothing more than resources to fuel their expansion." Jake stood, feeling something hard and determined settling in his chest. "How do we stop them?" "We cannot. But we can hurt them badly enough that they think twice about future operations." Vexhalia moved to the ship's main engineering console and began working with Jake's tools, its massive hands surprisingly delicate as they manipulated the controls. Jake watched in fascination as the alien bypassed security protocols and accessed systems he hadn't even known existed. "What are you doing?" "Preparing a message," Vexhalia replied, its claws dancing across the console with increasing speed. "The Vorthans believe my people are extinct or powerless. It is time to correct that misconception." The main display came alive with what Jake recognized as a transmission array, but the signal patterns were unlike anything in his experience. Vexhalia was broadcasting on frequencies that human equipment shouldn't have been able to generate, using modulations that made Jake's ears ache just listening to them. "You're calling for help? I am calling in a debt that has been outstanding for 300 years. The transmission lasted only a few seconds, but Jake felt it in his bones, a sound like the death of stars and the birth of galaxies, compressed into a signal that somehow carried meaning far beyond its component parts. "Now what?" Jake asked. "Now we survive long enough for the debt to be paid." The ship shuddered as something large docked with the hull again. Through the engineering deck's viewports, Jake could see the running lights of at least 3 more Vorthan vessels, each one larger than the merchant ship they were currently trying to escape from. "More friends of yours?" Jake asked. "The second wave," Vexhalia confirmed. "They are no longer trying to recapture me quietly. Now they simply want to ensure I do not escape." Jake looked around the ruined engineering deck, taking inventory of what was left functional. The main drive was offline, life support was running on backup power, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. But the ship wasn't completely dead yet. "I have an idea," Jake said slowly, "but you're probably not going to like it." "Explain." Jake moved to the emergency console and began pulling up system diagnostics. "This ship has been running on borrowed time for months. The plasma containment system is held together with patch jobs and wishful thinking, and the main reactor has a tendency to spike when it's under stress. You wish to overload the reactor? Not overload it. Destabilize it." Jake's fingers flew across the controls as he began implementing modifications that violated every safety protocol in the book. "If I can create a controlled instability in the plasma stream, I can make this ship look like it's about to explode while actually just venting superheated gas." Vexhalia watched Jake work with growing interest. "A deception. More than that. If I time it right, I can use the plasma vents to create a debris field that will mask our escape pod launch. The Vorthans will think we died in the explosion and will be drifting in space waiting for rescue. And if your timing is incorrect, then we actually explode and save the Vorthans the trouble of killing us." Vexhalia's rumbling laughter filled the engineering deck. "I begin to understand why the universe chose your species as allies. You fight like Kethvar, with courage that borders on insanity." Jake wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or an insult, but he decided to take it as encouragement. He'd nearly finished the modifications when new alarms began blaring throughout the ship. "They have breached the main hull in 4 locations," Vexhalia said, studying readings from sensors that Jake hadn't known were still functional. "We have perhaps 5 minutes before they reach this deck. That's cutting it close, but I can work with it." Jake finalized the plasma system modifications and moved to the escape pod controls. The ship carried 6 pods, but only 2 were still functional after the Vorthan assault. Jake began programming their launch sequence, while Vexhalia gathered supplies from around the engineering deck. "There is something you should know," Vexhalia said as Jake worked. "The transmission I sent. It will bring help, but not immediately. We may be on our own for several days." "How many days?" "Perhaps 3. Perhaps 7. The Kethvar fleet is scattered across the galaxy, and it will take time for them to reach this location." Jake paused in his work. "Fleet? I thought your people were extinct." "Another misconception that has served us well," Vexhalia replied. "The Kethvar did not die out, Jake Morrison. We simply learned to be invisible. Before Jake could ask for clarification, the engineering deck's main entrance exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal. Vorthan warriors poured through the breach, their weapons already firing as they advanced. "Now would be good!" Vexhalia shouted, raising its own weapon to return fire. Jake slammed his hand down on the emergency activation control, and the ship's main reactor began the carefully orchestrated dance between stability and catastrophic failure that he'd spent the last 10 minutes programming. Alarms screamed warnings about containment breach and plasma venting as the escape pod bay doors cycled open. "Go!" Jake yelled, grabbing his emergency kit and diving toward the pod access hatch. Vexhalia followed, moving backward while laying down covering fire that forced the Vorthans to take cover behind twisted bulkheads. Jake had the pod sealed and launch sequence initiated before the alien warrior had finished strapping itself into the oversized passenger seat. Launch in 3, 2, the escape pod ejected just as Jake's modifications reached their carefully calculated crescendo. From outside, the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream would appear to suffer a catastrophic reactor failure, venting plasma and debris in all directions before its main power core went dark. To any observers, it would look like everyone aboard had died instantly. In reality, Jake's modifications had created a spectacular light show, while leaving the ship intact but powerless. And hidden in the debris field, drifting on minimal life support, their escape pod waited for rescue that might be days away. "Well," Jake said, checking their supplies and finding them barely adequate for 2 people for perhaps 4 days. "At least we're not dead yet." Yet, Vexhalia agreed, settling into a meditation posture that somehow managed to look comfortable despite the pod's cramped confines. Jake activated the pod's passive sensors and began monitoring the Vorthan fleet's activities. As he'd hoped, they seemed to accept that their target had died in the explosion. After an hour of scanning the debris field, the alien ships departed, leaving only automated beacons to monitor the area. "They're gone," Jake reported. "For now." "They will return," Vexhalia said without opening its eyes. "But not immediately. The Vorthans are efficient. They will move on to other objectives and send a recovery team later to salvage anything useful from the wreckage." Jake settled back in his own seat and tried to get comfortable for what was likely to be a very long wait. "So what do we do now?" "Now we rest. Soon we will have much work to do." "What kind of work?" Vexhalia opened its burning eyes and fixed Jake with a stare that seemed to see into his future. "The kind that changes the course of wars, Jake Morrison. The kind that transforms ordinary maintenance technicians into legends that will be remembered until the stars burn cold." Jake looked down at the pendant still hanging around his neck, feeling its weight and warmth. "I never asked to be a legend. Legends rarely do," Vexhalia replied. "But sometimes the universe requires them anyway." Outside the pod's small viewport, Jake could see the scattered debris of the ship he'd called home for 2 years, drifting in the cold vacuum between stars. Somewhere in that darkness, Vorthan ships were hunting for any sign that their target had survived. And somewhere else, according to Vexhalia, an ancient fleet was beginning to move in response to a signal that hadn't been sent in 300 years. Jake Morrison, maintenance technician, coffee enthusiast, and accidental legend, settled in to wait for whatever came next. He had a feeling it was going to be extraordinary. 3 days drifting in the escape pod had given Jake plenty of time to think, and most of those thoughts centered around the growing certainty that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The food supplies were running low, the recycling system was making ominous clicking sounds, and Vexhalia spent most of its time in what appeared to be a meditative trance, occasionally making sounds that Jake was beginning to recognize as prayers or battle chants. On the morning of the 4th day, if morning had any meaning in the endless dark between stars, Jake was awakened by a sound he'd never heard before. It started as a low harmonic that seemed to come from everywhere at once, building slowly into something that made his teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges. "They come," Vexhalia said without opening its eyes. Jake scrambled to the pod's sensor console, trying to make sense of the readings that were suddenly flooding his displays. For a moment, he thought the equipment was malfunctioning. The energy signatures didn't match anything in his experience or training, and space itself seemed to tear open. Jake had seen ships emerge from hyperspace before, the brief flash of exotic radiation and the ripple effects that distorted local gravity for a few seconds. This was nothing like that. This was as if someone had grabbed reality by the edges and pulled it apart to reveal something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The first ship that emerged was impossible. Jake's brain struggled to process what he was seeing. A vessel that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight and shadow, its hull flowing like liquid metal while maintaining perfect structural integrity. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Clearly organic in some ways, but obviously engineered by intelligence that thought in concepts human science had never explored. Then more ships began emerging, each one unique but sharing the same impossible aesthetic of controlled chaos and mathematical perfection. Jake counted 12, then 20, then stopped counting as the display became too cluttered with contacts. "How many?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The 4th Claw Battle Group," Vexhalia replied, finally opening its eyes. 237 ships ranging from scouts to dreadnoughts, the largest military force my people have assembled in over 3 centuries. All for one rescue mission, all for you, Jake Morrison. Before Jake could ask what that meant, his communication console came alive with an incoming transmission. The signal was unlike anything human technology used. It bypassed the pod's normal receivers entirely and seemed to transmit directly into Jake's mind. The voice that spoke was clearly Kethvar, but somehow Jake understood every word perfectly. "Warsinger Vexhalia, last sword of the burning fleet, guardian of the deep void. We come at your call. What news of the Voidwalker?" Vexhalia leaned forward to respond, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made Jake's bones vibrate. The conversation continued in the alien language, but Jake found he could understand fragments of it, something about honor fulfilled, debts paid, and a new age beginning. "The Voidwalker?" Jake asked when the transmission ended. "You," Vexhalia said simply, "it is what they call you now. Why? Because you walked into the void between life and death to free me, knowing that it might cost you everything. Because you chose to help someone who was not your kind, not your species, not your responsibility. Because you acted with the kind of courage that my people thought had died with the ancient heroes." Jake felt suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of expectation he heard in Vexhalia's voice. "I just did what seemed right." Yes. That is precisely why they call you Voidwalker. The escape pod's proximity alarms began chiming as one of the Kethvar ships approached. Jake got his first close look at alien technology that made everything he'd ever worked with seem like primitive tools fashioned from scrap metal and wishful thinking. The ship that pulled them aboard was a scout vessel, but it was larger than any human cruiser Jake had ever seen. The docking bay they were brought to could have held a dozen escape pods, and the gravity felt somehow more natural than anything artificial systems usually produced. When the bay pressurized and the airlock cycled open, Jake got his first look at other members of Vexhalia's species. They were all variations on the same theme: massive, predatory, built for war, but carrying themselves with the kind of dignity that spoke of ancient culture and deep wisdom. Their fur ranged from midnight black to silver white. Their eyes burned with colors Jake had no names for, and every single one of them looked like they could tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands. What surprised Jake was their reaction to seeing him. Each Kethvar they encountered performed what was obviously a formal greeting, a complex gesture that involved touching their hearts, their foreheads, and then extending both hands palm up toward Jake. The gesture carried meaning that transcended language barriers, respect, recognition, and something that felt almost like reverence. "They honor you," Vexhalia explained as they walked through corridors that seemed to grow and shift around them. "Word of your actions has spread through the fleet. You are the first alien in 3,000 years to carry the mark of Kethvar friendship, and the first in our entire recorded history to earn it through willing sacrifice. Jake looked down at the pendant still hanging around his neck. It had changed somehow during their time in the escape pod, its surface now swirling with patterns that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. What exactly did you tell them I did? The truth. That you freed me knowing it would bring danger upon yourself, that you fought beside me against overwhelming odds, that you chose to help, even when helping meant risking everything. They reached what Jake assumed was the bridge, though it looked more like a temple than a command center. The space was vast and cathedral-like, with displays that floated in mid-air showing information in scripts and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Kethvar officers moved between stations with fluid grace, their work looking more like ritual dance than military operations. At the center of it all stood the ship's captain, an ancient Kethvar, whose fur was pure white and whose eyes held depths that suggested millennia of experience. When it saw Vexhalia, it performed a greeting that was clearly reserved for equals or superiors. When it saw Jake, it did something that made every other Kethvar on the bridge go absolutely silent. It knelt. "Voidwalker Jake Morrison," the captain said in perfectly accented standard, "I am Fleet Singer Thaxendra of the Fourth Claw. In the name of all Kethvar, I greet you and offer you the protection of our fleet." Jake looked around the bridge, taking in the sight of dozens of alien warriors watching him with expressions he couldn't read but that felt heavy with significance. "I'm honored," Jake said, meaning it, "but I'm not really sure what I did to deserve all this." Thaxandra rose and gestured toward the main display, which showed a tactical overview of local space. Jake could see the debris field where they'd been hiding, now swarming with Vorthan ships that had returned to salvage whatever they could find. "You have given us something we lost 3 centuries ago," Thaxandra said. "Pope, I don't understand." "Show him," Vexhalia said. The display changed, showing what Jake recognized as a star chart covering a vast area of the galaxy. Hundreds of systems were marked with symbols that Jake couldn't read, but the pattern was clear, a spreading infection of control that had consumed entire sectors. "The Vorthan Empire," Thaxandra explained. "For 300 years they have expanded without check, conquering species after species, consuming world after world. They convinced the galaxy that the Kethvar were extinct, that the great predator race had been tamed and destroyed. But you weren't," Jake said. "No, but we were diminished, scattered, hiding." Thaxandra's voice carried shame that cut through Jake's heart. "We had forgotten what it meant to fight for something greater than mere survival. Until I freed Vexhalia, until you reminded us that there are still beings in this galaxy worth fighting for," Vexhalia said. "Worth risking everything to protect." Jake looked around the bridge again, beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. "So what happens now?" "Now," Thaxandra said, "we remind the galaxy that the Kethvar are not extinct. We remind them that predators do not forgive, do not forget, and do not show mercy to those who would enslave the innocent. You're going to war. We never stopped being at war," Vexhalia corrected. "But now we fight as we once did, with purpose, with unity, and with allies worth dying for." The bridge's main display shifted again, showing the Vorthan salvage fleet that was currently picking through the remains of the Prosperity's dream. Jake counted at least 15 ships, including what looked like a mobile command base. "They still think we're dead," Jake observed. "Yes," Thaxandra said with satisfaction, "which makes them perfect targets for a demonstration." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of demonstration?" "The kind that sends a message across the galaxy," Vexhalia replied. "The kind that lets every enslaved world know that the predators have returned." Jake watched the tactical display as Kethvar ships began moving into attack positions around the unsuspecting Vorthan fleet. The alien vessels moved with a coordination that spoke of centuries of practice, flowing through space like schools of predatory fish preparing to strike. "Will you fight with us, Voidwalker?" Thaxandra asked. "Will you stand with the Kethvar as we reclaim our place among the stars?" Jake looked at the pendant around his neck, feeling its weight and warmth. He thought about the crew of the Prosperity's Dream, dead because they'd been unwitting accomplices to slavery. He thought about Vexhalia, imprisoned for 17 months while waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to set them free. He thought about all the worlds marked on that star chart, conquered and enslaved by an empire that seemed unstoppable. "I'm a maintenance technician," Jake said slowly. "I fix things that are broken." "And what needs fixing here?" Vexhalia asked. Jake looked at the display again, at the Vorthan ships that had killed innocent civilians and would undoubtedly kill more if left unchecked, at the spreading cancer of empire that had consumed half the galaxy. "Everything," Jake said with growing conviction. "The whole damn system is broken." Thaxandra's smile was sharp enough to cut reality. "Then let us begin repairs." The first phase of the attack was poetry written in violence and precision. Jake watched from the bridge as Kethvar ships emerged from stealth like ghosts materializing from the void, their weapons systems already locked onto targets before the Vorthans even knew they were under attack. The salvage fleet died in less than 4 minutes, their ships torn apart by weapons that seemed to bend the laws of physics to their will. Not a single Vorthan vessel managed to send a distress signal or escape the kill zone. "Phase 1 complete," Thaxandra reported. "No survivors, no witnesses, no evidence." "Phase 2?" Jake asked. "Phase 2," Vexhalia said, "is where we take the fight to them." On the display, Jake could see other Kethvar fleets beginning to move, emerging from hiding places scattered across the galaxy. Hundreds of ships, then thousands, all converging on Vorthan positions that had been considered secure for centuries. "How long have you been planning this?" Jake asked. 300 years, Thasandra replied. "We have been watching, waiting, preparing. All we needed was a reason to begin. And I gave you that reason? You gave us something better," Vexhalia said. "You gave us proof that not all of the galaxy has surrendered to the darkness. You gave us hope that there are still those willing to fight for what is right." Jake felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of starlight and responsibility. He'd thought he was just helping one prisoner escape. Instead, he'd apparently triggered the resumption of a galactic war that had been dormant for 3 centuries. "No pressure," he muttered. Vexhalia's rumbling laughter filled the bridge. "Indeed, Voidwalker, no pressure at all." As Jake watched the tactical display showing Kethvar fleets moving across the galaxy, he realized that his life as a simple maintenance technician was definitely over. Whatever came next was going to be extraordinary, terrifying, and probably far more dangerous than anything he'd ever imagined. But looking around at the alien warriors who had accepted him as family, who were willing to risk everything for the enslaved and protect the innocent, Jake found he was looking forward to finding out what came next. After all, he'd always been good at fixing broken things. And the galaxy definitely needed some serious repairs. 6 months after Jake Morrison freed a caged alien and accidentally restarted a galactic war, he stood on the command deck of the Kethvar dreadnought Starfire's Edge, watching the largest space battle in recorded history unfold across the Vorthan home system. The transformation had been remarkable. Jake no longer looked like a simple maintenance technician. The Kethvar had provided him with armor that seemed to be made from crystallized shadow and light, weapons that responded to his thoughts rather than his hands, and modifications to his biology that allowed him to keep up with beings who had been engineered for warfare across millennia. The pendant around his neck had grown into something that looked more like a constellation of living stars, marking him as not just Kethvar friend, but as something the aliens called Void Singer, one who could hear the harmony of the universe and bend it to his will. Jake still wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but he'd learned to work with it. "Status report," Jake said, the words coming out in the harmonic language of the Kethvar, despite his having never formally learned it. The modifications to his vocal cords and brain made translation unnecessary. He thought in standard and spoke in whatever language was most appropriate for the situation. 17 Vorthan fleet groups have surrendered. Thaxandra reported, her fur now bearing scars from dozens of battles but her eyes burning brighter than ever. The siege of Nexus Station is complete. All slave pens have been opened and the prisoners are being evacuated to safe worlds. Resistance? Minimal. Word of the Void Walker spreads faster than our fleets move. Many worlds surrender the moment our ships arrive in system. Jake nodded, but he felt no satisfaction in the victories. Each conquered world revealed fresh horrors, entire species that had been enslaved for generations, children who had never known freedom, cultures that had been systematically destroyed to make their people more compliant. The Vorthan Empire hadn't just conquered territory, they'd consumed souls. What about the core worlds? Jake asked. That, Vexhalia said, emerging from the shadows near the command platform, is where things become interesting. Jake's old friend and partner had also changed during the months of warfare. Where once Vexhalia had been a skilled warrior, it was now something approaching legend. The other Kethfar spoke of the war singer's deeds in hushed tones, single-handedly liberating prison worlds, defeating Vorthan champions in personal combat, and leading boarding actions that had become the stuff of epic poetry. Define interesting, Jake said. The Vorthan Emperor has agreed to personal combat, Vexhalia said. Its voice carrying harmonics that Jake had learned indicated barely controlled fury. Single combat between champions, winner takes all. And he chose his champion. He chose himself. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Vorthan Emperor was old, ancient even by the standards of his long-lived species, but he hadn't maintained control of half the galaxy for 3 centuries by being weak. Intelligence reports suggested that he was the result of genetic modification programs that spanned millennia, enhanced far beyond the capabilities of his base species. Who fights for us? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. There is only one choice, Thaxandra said. Only one among us who carries the authority to speak for all Kethfar. Vexhalia? Jake said. No, Vexhalia replied with something that might have been amusement. The Void Walker. Jake stared at his friend, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders again. Me? I'm not a champion. Ha ha ha! I'm not even a real warrior. You are the one who started this war, Vexhalia said gently. You are the one who reminded us what we were fighting for. You are the one who proved that freedom is worth any risk, any sacrifice. I just freed one prisoner. And in doing so, you freed us all. Jake looked around the command deck, taking in the faces of alien warriors who had come to regard him as something between a military commander and a religious figure. The responsibility was staggering. Millions of beings across hundreds of worlds looking to him for leadership in a fight that would determine the shape of the galaxy for centuries to come. When? Jake asked. Tomorrow, Thaxandra said, on the neutral moon of Kethamoran, under the ancient protocols of honorable combat. And if I lose? Then the Kethfar withdraw to the void between galaxies, the freed worlds return to Vorthan control, and the galaxy remains enslaved. No pressure, Jake said, echoing words he'd spoken months ago under very different circumstances. But this time, nobody laughed. The journey to Kethmoran took 12 hours, during which Jake tried to prepare for combat against an opponent who had been perfecting the art of warfare since before humans had discovered fire. The Kethfar had provided him with the best training they could offer, teaching him techniques that combined their natural predatory instincts with technology that bordered on magic. Jake had learned to move faster than human reflexes should have allowed, to fight with weapons that responded to thought rather than muscle, and to see patterns in combat that most beings couldn't perceive. But he was still fundamentally human, and humans had been part of galactic civilization for less than 2 centuries. His opponent had been conquering worlds since before Earth had developed written language. Kethmoran was a small moon orbiting a dead world in a system that had been neutral territory for millennia. The surface was barren rock and ancient ruins, but beneath the ground lay chambers that had been used for formal combat since before recorded history. It was here that disputes between star-spanning civilizations were settled according to rules that predated most galactic governments. The combat arena was a sphere perhaps 100 meters across, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when Jake wasn't looking directly at them. At the center, 2 platforms waited, one for each combatant. Jake arrived first, accompanied by Vexhalia and a small honor guard. The Kethvar warriors took positions around the arena's perimeter, their presence both supporting and witnessing whatever was about to happen. When the Vorthan Emperor arrived, Jake understood immediately why this being had been able to conquer half the galaxy. The Emperor was tall even by Vorthan standards, perhaps 9 feet in height, with the kind of presence that seemed to bend space around itself. Its skin was metallic silver, marked with patterns that looked like circuitry. Its eyes burned with cold intelligence, and its movements carried the deadly grace of a predator that had never known defeat. But it was the aura of absolute authority that surrounded the being that truly impressed Jake. This was someone who had given orders that shaped the destiny of billions, who had made decisions that determined which species lived and which died, who had wielded power on a scale that most beings couldn't even comprehend. "So," the Emperor said, its voice carrying harmonics that made Jake's bones ache, "you are the maintenance technician who thinks he can topple empires." "I'm the human who thinks slavery is wrong," Jake replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Slavery is efficiency, order imposed upon chaos, the strong directing the weak toward purposes greater than they could achieve alone. Slavery is the strong being too lazy or cowardly to find willing partners." The Emperor's laugh was like breaking glass and dying stars. "We shall see which philosophy proves superior." The formal protocols were observed, ancient words spoken in languages that predated most current civilizations, rituals performed that acknowledged the significance of what was about to happen. When it was done, Jake and the Emperor stood on their respective platforms, weapons in hand, while representatives of a dozen neutral species served as witnesses and judges. "Begin," the Arbiter declared. The Emperor moved first, crossing the distance between them with speed that Jake's enhanced reflexes barely managed to track. The alien's weapon, something that looked like crystallized lightning, left trails of energy in the air as it cut toward Jake's head. Jake ducked, rolled, and came up with his own weapon, a sword that Vexhalia had forged for him from metals that existed only in the hearts of dying stars. The blade met the Emperor's weapon with a sound like reality tearing, sending sparks that burned with impossible colors. What followed was less a fight than a deadly dance performed at superhuman speed. The Emperor was older, more experienced, and enhanced by centuries of genetic modification and technological augmentation, but Jake had something that his opponent had never encountered: the desperate creativity of someone who had spent his entire life solving problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. Where the Emperor fought with perfect technique refined across millennia, Jake fought with improvisation and adaptation. Where the Emperor relied on proven strategies and overwhelming force, Jake used misdirection and innovation. Where the Emperor sought to dominate through superiority, Jake sought to win through understanding. The battle raged across the arena, leaving scars in the ancient walls and filling the air with energies that made reality blur around the edges. Jake took hits that should have been fatal, his enhanced healing keeping him functional long enough to return the favor. The Emperor fought with the confidence of someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. But as the minutes passed, Jake began to notice something. His opponent was slowing down. Not much. The difference was measured in milliseconds and barely perceptible variations in timing. But Jake had spent years maintaining machinery that operated on tolerances measured in microscopic fractions, and he'd learned to notice the smallest deviations from expected performance. The Emperor was old, ancient even, and despite all the enhancements and modifications, despite the genetic tampering and technological augmentation, time was still taking its toll. Jake began to adapt his tactics, focusing not on overpowering his opponent, but on wearing him down. He used the arena itself as a weapon, leading the Emperor through patterns of movement that forced the alien to work harder while Jake conserved energy. He attacked and withdrew, struck and faded, created openings and then refused to commit to them. Coward! The Emperor snarled, its perfect composure finally cracking. Stand and fight! I am fighting, Jake replied, breathing hard but still moving. I'm just doing it smart, instead of proud. The Emperor's next attack was driven by fury rather than technique, and Jake saw his opening. Instead of trying to block or dodge, he stepped inside the Emperor's guard and drove his sword upward, punching through armor that had turned aside weapons designed to crack planets. The blade found the Emperor's heart, and for a moment the arena was absolutely silent. Then the ancient conqueror smiled, its metallic face expressing something that might have been respect. Well played, maintenance technician, the Emperor said, its voice growing weaker as artificial circulatory systems failed. Perhaps, the galaxy is ready for a different kind of order. The Emperor fell, and with its death, an empire that had ruled half the galaxy for 3 centuries came to an end. Jake stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen wounds, but alive. Around the arena, the witnesses began to speak in hushed tones, recording the moment for history. It is finished, the arbiter declared. The combat is decided. The Vorthan Empire yields to the Kethvar Alliance. Jake looked around the arena, taking in the faces of beings who would carry news of this day across the galaxy. In a few hours, every civilized world would know that the Emperor was dead and that the age of Vorthan dominance had ended. But Jake felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a deep sadness for all the lives that had been lost during the centuries of Imperial rule. What happens now? Jake asked Vexhalia as they left the arena. Now we rebuild, his friend replied. We help the freed worlds establish their own governments. We ensure that the former Imperial territories develop in ways that serve their people rather than distant masters. And we make sure that nothing like the Vorthan Empire ever rises again. And me? You continue to be what you have always been, Vexhalia said with that rumbling sound that Jake had learned was laughter. A maintenance technician who fixes broken things. The galaxy's a pretty big repair job. Yes, but you have help now. The entire Kethvar species, plus all the worlds we've liberated, plus however many other species decide they want to be part of something better than an empire built on slavery. Jake looked up at the stars visible through the arena's transparent dome, thinking about all the worlds out there that would soon be free to choose their own destinies. It would be messy, complicated, and probably involve more conflict as different groups tried to fill the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse. But it would be better than what came before, and Jake had learned that sometimes better was the best you could hope for. So, Jake said as they walked toward the waiting ships that would carry them back to their fleets, "What's next on the maintenance schedule?" Vexhalia's laughter echoed through the ancient corridors, and Jake found himself smiling despite the magnitude of the work ahead. He'd started this journey as a simple maintenance technician who'd stumbled into a situation far beyond his understanding. He was ending it as Jake Morrison, Voidwalker, first friend of the Kethvar, and apparently the person responsible for rebuilding galactic civilization. But at heart, he was still just someone who fixed broken things, and there was always something that needed fixing. And a fearless human mechanic freed an enslaved feline predator, unaware the War Guardian had chosen him.